Every single recession in modern American history has followed the same pattern. The wealthy get through it. The poor suffer through it with the same government assistance they always had. And the middle class, the people who worked hardest, saved most responsibly, followed every piece of conventional financial advice they were ever given, get absolutely destroyed, not temporarily inconvenienced, not mildly set back, destroyed, financially set back by years, sometimes decades, in a period of months. And the part that should genuinely enrage you is this: it is not bad luck. It is not random. It is not the unfortunate but unavoidable consequence of economic forces that affect everyone equally. The middle class gets destroyed in every recession for specific, documented, structural reasons that are completely predictable in advance. Reasons that the people at the top of the economic ladder understand deeply and structure their financial lives to avoid. Reasons that the financial education system, the mainstream media, and the institutions that benefit from middle-class financial fragility have very little incentive to explain clearly. Today, I am going to explain them clearly. All have them. And then I am going to show you exactly what to do about each one. Not with generic advice about emergency funds and diversification that you have heard 1,000 times, but with the specific structural changes that actually determine which side of the recession divide you end up on. Stay with me through the entire video, because the last section, the part about how to actually protect yourself, contains something that almost no financial content ever addresses directly. And it is the thing that makes the difference between the middle-class families who come out of recessions intact and the ones who spend years trying to rebuild what they lost. Let us start with the structural reality of middle-class finances that makes the recession vulnerability so severe. And that is the concept of what economists call the balance sheet trap. The American middle class has been systematically encouraged for decades to build a financial life that looks wealthy but is structurally fragile in ways that only become visible under economic stress. The house with a mortgage, the car with the loan, the retirement account that cannot be touched without penalties, the lifestyle maintained on two incomes with very little margin between what comes in and what goes out. From the outside, this looks like prosperity. From a structural financial perspective, it is a collection of fixed obligations held together by the assumption that both incomes continue, that the jobs are stable, that the mortgage payment never becomes impossible, and that nothing goes significantly wrong at the wrong time. Recessions are specifically the wrong time, and every single one of those assumptions gets stress-tested simultaneously. The mortgage does not care that the economy is in recession. The car payment does not pause because your hours were cut. The credit card minimum does not become optional because your bonus was eliminated. The health insurance premium does not decrease because your income did. The fixed obligations of the middle-class financial structure, the obligations that were perfectly manageable when both incomes were flowing and employment was stable, become a vice that tightens every month that the income disruption continues. This is the balance sheet trap, and it is the primary reason that middle-class families who look financially comfortable under normal conditions find themselves in genuine crisis within 3 to 6 months of a significant recession. Not because they were irresponsible, not because they overspent dramatically, but because their financial structure was built for stability and had almost no capacity to absorb sustained instability. The second structural vulnerability is the one that most people experience as the most shocking and the most unfair. And that is the way recessions interact with home equity, which for most middle-class families is their largest and most important financial asset. Home equity is the primary store of middle-class wealth in America, not stock portfolios, not retirement accounts. For the median American family, the equity in their home represents more than 60% of their total net worth. It is the asset they plan to use for retirement. It is the asset they expect to pass to their children. It is the financial foundation on which everything else is built. During a recession, that foundation becomes dangerously unstable in two simultaneous ways. The first is the direct price decline. In significant recessions, home prices fall, During the 2008 recession, the median American home lost approximately 30% of its value. Families who had bought at the peak of the market with a small down payment found themselves underwater, owing more on their mortgage than the house was worth. Families who had borrowed against their equity through home equity lines of credit found that equity had disappeared, leaving them with the debt, but not the asset value that justified it. The second way recessions damage home equity is more insidious and more common than outright price collapse, and that is the forced sale at the wrong time. When income disruption continues long enough that the mortgage payment becomes impossible to make, families are forced to sell. Not because they want to, not because it is the right financial decision, because the monthly obligation cannot be met and the alternative is foreclosure. And when you are forced to sell during a recession, when buyer demand is low, when credit is tight, when every seller in your neighborhood is in the same position, you sell at the worst possible price. You crystallize the loss at the exact moment when Holden would eventually have allowed recovery. The people who lose their homes during recessions are not primarily the people who were financially irresponsible. They are the people whose financial structure had no margin, no cushion between what they owed and what they could sustain during a period of income disruption. And in the middle class, that margin is structurally thin because the entire financial architecture of middle-class life is built around the assumption that the income continues. The third structural vulnerability is the retirement account trap. And this one is particularly devastating because it takes something that was supposed to be a long-term wealth-building tool and turns it into an emergency resource that is accessed at exactly the worst time, with penalties and tax consequences that amplify the financial damage far beyond the immediate costs. The data on what happens to retirement accounts during recessions is consistent and disturbing. During the 2008 recession, approximately 6 million Americans made early withdrawals from their retirement accounts. Not because they wanted to access that money early, because they had no other option once their emergency funds were exhausted and their income was disrupted. They paid the 10% early withdrawal penalty. They paid income tax on the full amount withdrawn. And then, because their accounts were now smaller and the market was near its bottom, they missed the entire subsequent recovery. The recovery that would have multiplied the money they withdrew by 3, 4, or 5 times over the following decade. The mathematical cost of a single early retirement account withdrawal during a recession is almost never fully calculated by the people making the withdrawal. Because in the moment, the calculation is simple and urgent. I need money now, and this is where the money is. But the full cost includes the penalty, the taxes, the loss compounding on the withdrawn amount for the remaining years until retirement, and the psychological damage of seeing your retirement account significantly depleted, which often leads to reduced contributions in the subsequent years as the family tries to rebuild its immediate financial stability. A $30,000 early withdrawal at age 40 after the 10% penalty in taxes, leaving approximately $18,000 in actual cash received costs, somewhere between $150,000 and $250,000 in lost retirement wealth. Depending on assumptions about market returns and time to retirement, that is the real price of having no other option when the recession hits. And it is a price paid overwhelmingly by middle-class families, the people who have retirement accounts but do not have enough other financial resources to avoid accessing them during crises. The fourth structural vulnerability is the debt spiral, and this is the mechanism that turns a temporary recession impact into a multi-year financial recovery that never quite gets back to where it started. When income is disrupted and savings are insufficient to cover the gap, the universal response is debt, credit card debt, personal loans, borrowed money from family, deferred payments that accrue interest. Whatever form it takes, debt becomes the bridge between what is needed and what is available. And debt, in a recessionary environment, with high uncertainty and often higher interest rates on consumer products, is extraordinarily expensive. The average credit card interest rate in America currently exceeds 20%. A family that uses $15,000 in credit card debt to survive a 6-month income disruption during a recession and then spends the next 3 years paying it off at minimum payments will pay approximately $9,000 in interest on top of the $15,000 principal. The total cost of the debt bridge is $24,000, 60% more than what was actually needed. And during the 3 years they are paying that debt, they are not rebuilding their emergency fund. They are not increasing their retirement contributions. They are not investing. Every dollar of cash flow that could be building future financial security is instead servicing the cost of past financial crises. This is the debt spiral. And it is the mechanism that explains why middle-class families who experience a single significant recession setback often find themselves still financially behind 5 years later, not because they made additional bad decisions, but because the initial debt taken on to survive the recession created an ongoing financial burden that consumed the cash flow that would otherwise have rebuilt their financial position. Now let us talk about protection. Real protection. Not the advice you have heard before, but the specific structural changes that break each of the 4 vulnerabilities I have described. The first structural protection is what I call the margin layer. A concept that goes beyond the standard emergency fund advice in a way that specifically addresses the balance sheet trap. The problem with conventional emergency fund advice is that it is calibrated for a normal job loss event, not a recessionary job loss event. 3 to 6 months of expenses as an emergency fund assumes you will find new work within that time frame. During a recession, that assumption is often wrong. The margin layer is different from an emergency fund in 2 specific ways. The first is size. During periods of elevated economic risk, the margin layer should be 6 to 12 months of true essential expenses, not lifestyle expenses. True essential expenses are rent or mortgage, utilities, basic food, insurance, and minimum debt payments. Everything else, subscriptions, dining out, entertainment, non-essential purchases, can be eliminated immediately if necessary. Knowing that your true essential expenses are covered for 12 months, regardless of what happens to your income changes every decision you make during a recession. You do not have to take the first job offered. You do not have to sell assets at the bottom. You do not have to go into high-interest debt. You have time to make good decisions instead of desperate ones. The second way the margin layer differs from a conventional emergency fund is that it should be held in a high-yield savings account earning as close to the current rate of inflation as possible. Currently, 4 to 5% of the best online banks, rather than in a checking account, earning nothing on a 12-month margin layer of $30,000. The difference between 0% and 4.5% is $1,350 per year. That is money created from the margin layer itself simply by holding it in the right instrument. The second structural protection is income architecture, and this is the concept that most directly addresses the single point of failure problem that makes middle-class families so vulnerable to recession. The middle-class financial structure typically depends on 1 or 2 employment income streams. When one is disrupted, which recessions do with extraordinary efficiency, the entire structure is immediately stressed. Income architecture means deliberately building your household income so that it comes from multiple sources that are not all vulnerable to the same economic forces simultaneously. This does not require starting a business or becoming an entrepreneur in the conventional sense. It requires identifying what skills, knowledge, and professional expertise you already have that could generate income independently of your primary employer, and then building that secondary income stream before you need it rather than after. The specific form this takes is different for every person. A marketing professional building freelance clients on the side, an accountant doing tax preparation independently during tax season, a teacher offering tutoring services, a skilled tradesperson taking weekend jobs independently, a writer creating content for multiple clients rather than one employer. The specific form matters far less than the principle that when your primary income is disrupted by a recession, something else continues to flow. Even $1,000 to $2,000 per month from a secondary income source dramatically changes the math of how long your margin layer needs to last and how much debt you need to take on to bridge the gap. The third structural protection is what I call the debt floor, the minimum monthly fixed obligation that your household carries regardless of what happens to income. The lower your debt floor, the more resilient your financial structure is. To income disruption, this does not mean being philosophically opposed to all debt. It means being strategic and ruthless about the distinction between debt that is working for you, low-rate fixed debt against appreciating assets, and debt that is working against you, high-rate consumer debt against depreciating assets or pure consumption. Every dollar of high-interest consumer debt you eliminate before a recession arrives is a dollar of monthly obligation. That cannot trap you during the recession. Every month you spend reducing your debt floor, paying off the credit card, eliminating the car payment, avoiding new consumer debt is a month you are making your financial structure more resilient to exactly the kind of income disruption that recessions produce. The fourth structural protection is the most counterintuitive of all, and it is the one that separates the people who come out of recessions in a dramatically stronger position from the people who simply survive them. It is maintaining, and if possible increasing, your investment contributions during the recession itself. I understand how counterintuitive this sounds. When income is under stress, when uncertainty is high, when the market is down 30 or 40% and every financial headline is apocalyptic, the last thing that feels right is to keep putting money into investments that are visibly losing value. The psychological pull to stop, to preserve cash, to wait until things stabilize is overwhelming. But here's what the data shows with absolute consistency across every significant recession in modern financial history. The people who maintained their investment contributions, who kept buying index funds during the 2009 bottom, who kept contributing to their 401k when the market was down 40%, who kept purchasing assets when everything felt most uncertain, captured the entire subsequent recovery. Every dollar they invested at the bottom bought assets that were worth 2, 3, 4 times as much within 5 years. The people who stopped, who cut their contributions to preserve cash, who moved their retirement accounts to money market funds to stop the bleeding, who waited until things felt stable again before resuming, missed the recovery. They stopped buying at the exact moment when buying was most advantageous and resumed at the exact moment when it was least advantageous. And the long-term cost of that timing, not in dramatic losses, but in missed compounding, is often worth more than the income disruption itself. The practical way to maintain this discipline during the psychological pressure of a recession is to automate it completely and treat it as a non-negotiable fixed expense the same way you treat your rent or your mortgage. Your retirement contribution is not discretionary. It does not get cut when things get difficult. It runs automatically, every pay period, regardless of what the market is doing or what the financial headlines say. If you have built the margin layer and the income architecture described earlier, you have the financial cushion to maintain this discipline even when every instinct is screaming at you to stop. The middle class gets destroyed in every recession for 4 structural reasons: the balance sheet trap with no margin, the home equity vulnerability to forced sales, the retirement account trap that converts long-term wealth into short-term survival cash, and the debt spiral that turns temporary disruption into multi-year financial recovery. Each of these vulnerabilities has a specific structural solution: the margin layer that provides time for good decisions, the income architecture that eliminates the single point of failure, the debt floor reduction that lowers fixed monthly obligations, and the investment discipline that captures the recovery rather than missing it. None of these solutions are available instantly. All of them require building before the recession arrives, which is precisely why most people do not have them in place when the recession hits. The urgency of financial preparation is lowest when the need for it is also lowest. During economic expansions, when employment is strong, incomes growing, and recessions feel distant and theoretical. But recessions are not distant and theoretical. They are a normal, recurring feature of every economy that has ever existed. They arrive on schedule, roughly every 7 to 10 years. with a reliability that makes preparation not just advisable but mathematically obvious for anyone who takes the long view of their financial life. The question is never whether the next recession is coming. It is whether you will be ready when it does. If this video gave you a clearer picture of why the middle class is so specifically vulnerable to recessions and what to actually do about it, hit that like button and subscribe. We post every single week with financial content that goes this deep on the real mechanisms of how wealth is built, protected, and lost. Drop a comment below. Which of the 4 vulnerabilities hit closest to your current financial situation? I read every single one. See you in the next one.